Have you ever sat in a courtroom and just watched the proceedings? Um, Several years ago, I had a member of my church who he had gotten into some legal problems and he was getting out and his life was coming back together. But I was invited to go and watch the proceedings in court. I was invited to go and just be there as a support and encouragement, and it was my first time ever sitting and watching the proceedings. I'd never really done that before, and I watched as the people got up, the different lawyers got up, and they made their arguments, and it seemed that the judge was perpetually irritated with everybody, and what was interesting as I watched it was just how much tension there was in the middle of this seemingly low tension case. And I've thought about that trial as I've been thinking about this particular passage. That trial had almost no weight to it. Other trials have a lot more. You think of some of the trials, some of the great and important trials of history, the trial of Socrates, the trial of Martin Luther, the trial of Charles I of England, who lost his throne. You think of Marie Antoinette and all the drama in the French Revolution. You think of OJ, you think of the great trials, and those had a lot more tension and a lot more importance. The trial that we're looking at is the most important trial in the history of the world because it's the trial of the King of Kings. And this morning we're going to be diving into it as we go back to the Gospel of John. We've been going through the Gospel of John for about 2 years now, looking at the life of Jesus in the Gospel of John, wrestling with it, thinking about it, struggling with all that it has to say. Our approach is to tackle everything, avoid nothing, dive into everything. And so for over 2 years now, we've been going through the Gospel of John, looking at what it has to say. And this morning, as we come out of Christmas, we're diving back in, and the question we're confronted with is, what is John showing us through the Gospel of John? And what does Scripture show us as we look at the trial? What is John showing us through the trial, and what does Scripture show us when we look at the trial? And one of the things we have to remember when we look at the trial of Jesus is that no one gospel gives us every part. When you look at the Gospels, you look at all four Gospels, you see that there's 6 parts to the trial of Jesus. First, he's questioned after he's arrested by a cohort of soldiers. A cohort could have run anywhere from 200 to 1,000 soldiers. It was an overwhelming show of force. And remember, Jesus knocks them all down just simply by declaring, "I am he," showing that he's completely in charge. He then submits to being bound and arrested, and he goes with his captors. And first he's taken to Annas, who's the father-in-law of Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the high priest for the year, but Annas was in many ways, we're going to talk about in a little bit, the power behind the high priesthood. And then from there, he's taken to Caiaphas and the whole of the Sanhedrin. And after that, he goes, they have a second trial. That trial, the first trial before the Sanhedrin happens in the dark of night. And then after, they know that it's illegal, so they have a second trial, which is essentially a repeat of the first one to make sure that everything is gotten a rubber stamp. And then they cart him off to Pilate. And John skips over that trial before the Sanhedrin, but the other Gospels tell us about it. And then after, Pilate interviews and questions Jesus and looks to release him. And then from there, he gets sent, Luke tells us, to Herod. And then Herod asks him questions and doesn't get anywhere, and so he sends him back to Pilate, where eventually he's sentenced. So no one gospel gives us every piece. But when we look at the Gospel of John, we see that John is filling in the gaps of the other Gospels, and so he alone tells us about Annas. And and he alone tells us about the conversation between Jesus and and Pilate, where Pilate scoffingly says, "What is truth?" But when you look at all of it, when you look at all the details, when you look at all the different pieces, you see that in the end, both ecclesiastical and temporal authorities, both religious and civil government authorities, take part in trying Jesus and condemning his to death. And the question we're faced with is, what is John showing us about Jesus through the account of Jesus' trial? What is Scripture showing us through the account of Jesus' trial? And remember, John has a specific goal. He says, I left a ton of things out, but these things were written. These things were written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. He's got a specific goal. He wants to show you who Jesus is and what he's about. And he's continuing to do that as he recounts the trial of Jesus. And so the question that we're faced with is what is he showing us? And when we look at this, we see four truths when we look at the trial of Jesus. First, Jesus is the judge. Now, he's on trial, but he's ultimately the judge. But then beyond that, Jesus is the judge who's judged. Jesus is the judge who was judged. And then third, Jesus is the judge that will judge ultimately. And beyond that, he's the judge whose judgment changes you. And so I just want to walk through this passage and walk through the accounts of the trial and stop and think about what we see when we look through it. The first truth we see is that Jesus is the judge. When you look through here, all through here, he's showing that he's in charge. He may be the one that's arrested. He may be the one on trial, but he's the king and the judge. He's ultimately in charge. And we should not miss this. All through the Passion narratives, Jesus is directing the events. We see this first when you go back and look at the arrest. You see that he's picking the place, he's picking the situation, and then when the soldiers come to arrest him, they show up with an overwhelming force, and he basically sends them flying with ease, just at a word. And everybody realizes that if we're going to take him in, he's coming of his own accord, which is why they let the disciples leave. But when they take him, they start by taking him not to Caiaphas, not to the Sanhedrin. They take him to Annas. Now, who is Annas? Annas, we're told, is the father-in-law of the high priest, but there's more to it than that. Annas was the high priest from 5 to 15 AD, and then the Romans deposed him. One of Pilate's predecessors removed him, and the reason they did so was that they wanted control of the high priesthood. And so they took the job away, and then Josephus tells us that it passed from one member of his family to another member to another member. All in all, 5 of his sons and Caiaphas, his son-in-law, held the high priesthood. But while a lot of different people held the high priesthood, when you look back in the Old Testament, you see that the high priesthood was for life. And so many people still saw him as the true high priest. And you actually see that here when you look through that Caiaphas is called the high priest for the year, but then when Jesus is standing before Annas, we're told in verse 19 that the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and teaching. And then only down in 24 are we told that Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So very much, everybody seems to think of Annas as the true high priest. And so they take him before Annas, and Annas doesn't put him in a full trial. Annas seems to be doing some informal questioning of Jesus. And Annas has 2 questions. They're around his disciples and his doctrine. And what most commentators think is that the ordering of his topics indicates that he's concerned about the question, are the disciples a threat to me? Are they going to come and try to rescue Jesus and break him out? And the teaching is secondary. Annas seems to be wondering, is there an organized army, a chain of command with regimental divisions and so forth? And And are they coming for my position? He's worried about protecting the gift God has given him rather than knowing the God that gave the gifts. One writer noted that this is a common error with God's gifts. God gives a good and holy gift, such as sex or authority or stewardship of resources, and humans exalt their pleasure, their power, and their money over God himself. They refuse to worship God because they're intent on making idols of his gifts, and Annas is a case study in all of that. But notice what happens. When he starts questioning Jesus, Jesus doesn't start spilling his guts. I had Joseph read 1984 earlier in the year, and I eventually sat down and read through it and finished it up. And one of the things you see is that in 1984, everybody, when they're faced with the authorities, spill their guts. And you see that throughout history. You look at different totalitarian rulers and tyrants, and whenever people are called before them, so often everybody just breaks before them. Jesus stares this man down, and he doesn't bend, and he doesn't scrape. He doesn't say, it's the high priest, I need to be deferential. And the high priest should have been accorded, and by rights was due a certain amount of respect. And Paul, in Acts, you see that Paul is short with the high priest, and then he realizes what he's done, and he apologizes because he recognizes that this man has a position, and he's due a certain amount of respect. But Jesus doesn't feel the need to show this man the level of respect because he knows that he is the one that is truly greater. And so he looks at Annas, and he says, I've done nothing wrong. I've spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in the synagogues and the temples where all the Jews come together. I've done nothing in secret. In other words, I didn't skulk in the shadows. This was a very public ministry. And all you have to do is go around and ask people, and you will find out that this is so. And at this point, as he calls the high priest out, one of the high priest's servants strikes him and says, is this how you answer the high priest? And it's worth noting there that when he strikes him, he doesn't cuff him with his hand. The word there has to do with him striking somebody with a rod or a staff. And so John may see that as a fulfillment of prophecy, but that's important to just notice that he doesn't just cuff him. He strikes him with a rod. In some ways you're almost being primed to see this as a pointer back to the Old Testament. But notice what happens. Jesus pushes back. He said, if what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? In other words, I've done nothing wrong. I'm innocent. And notice, Annas is actually the one that's trying to do something illegal. You weren't allowed to try to get somebody to give testimony against themselves. Just like in our course today, you can't force them to give evidence against themselves. They may slip up, but you can't compel that. They can take the fifth. And so Annas is grossly violating the law, and so Jesus is pushing back. And he's doing so first because what Annas is doing is illegal, but even more so because Annas, as the high priest, may be important. But his dignity does not compare to Jesus. One commentator noted that unbeknownst to the officials and high priests, the dignity of the high priest derived from the dignity of Jesus. The high priest held a sacred office only because God is sacred. The sacred and holy God stands trial before those made sacred by what he has given them, and they hold their own dignity more dearly than his. Indeed, they don't even acknowledge his identity. But notice, while they don't acknowledge it, Jesus doesn't give an inch. He calls the high priest out, and in essence, he's saying, you have no right to judge me. I'm the true judge. I'm the true king. You have no right to call me to account. You're the one treating me in an illegal way. And notice, Annas kind of gets the point, because he doesn't ask another question. He just sends Jesus on to Caiaphas. He seems to recognize that Jesus has an authority that is inviolable, ultimately, that he can't compare to, and he moves Jesus on down the line. But then what happens next? We're told that he sends him to Caiaphas, the high priest, and John, being John, has skipped that. John all through the gospel is telling us about things that the other gospels didn't tell us about and skipping over things that they have told us about. John is the last writer. He's filling in the gaps. And you see here that he continues to fill in the gaps. But he says, so he just sort of nods to the fact that Jesus stands trial before Caiaphas in the Sanhedrin. But look at what happens there when you flip over to Mark. Jesus is taken before the Sanhedrin, and when they take him before the Sanhedrin, all of this is happening at Caiaphas' house, and they start to question him. We're told that they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes come together. This is the Sanhedrin, which is like the supreme court and an ultimate ruling body. And we're told that they were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy the temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands.' Yet even about their testimony did not agree." And so what's going on here? When they bring Jesus before the Sanhedrin, they are after a specific charge. They want to get a specific charge to stick, and that charge is that Jesus said he'll tear down the temple and destroy it. And this is a serious charge because the temple was the beating heart of Judaism. It wasn't just a church on the street corner. It was the center of worship, of music, of politics, of society, of national celebration and mourning. It was a place where Israel's God had promised to live in the midst of his people, as one commentator notes. It was the focal point of the nation and of the national way of life. And if Jesus had truly said that, that would have been a capital crime. This would have been seen as an act of sacrilege and vandalism and something aimed at the very heart of the nation. But here's the thing. Jesus never said that he would destroy the temple. He said destroy this temple, and he was speaking about his own self. He predicted that it would be destroyed, but he didn't call for it to happen. And so what happens? They all start asking, all the witnesses start coming, and they can't line up because they're making it up. And so their case is falling apart. Due process of the day, just as now, said that witness testimony has to line up or the prosecutor has no case, and the whole thing has to be thrown out. And so they get stuck, but what happens? At that point, when they're stuck, when they're doing an incredible amount of illegal things, the trial's happening at night when it's supposed to be happening at day. It should have been happening in the hall of the Sanhedrin. It's happening at the home of the high priest. It includes no formal indictment of Jesus. It includes the high priest stepping into the court case, which high priests were supposed to stay out of things because it was an abuse of power. And it doesn't, and it includes the evidence not lining up. So what do? They get desperate and they say justice, due process, whatever, and they start trying to get Jesus to say something intimidating. In the midst of everything, Jesus is being silent, and so what do? They put Jesus under oath to testify against himself. Mark says that the high priest stood up in the midst and asked, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" And Jesus doesn't answer. And then he says, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Matthew adds that the high priest says, "I adjure you by the living God, are you the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed?" And so Caiaphas is charging him to speak and calling on God and challenging him before God, making this oath. And this is a very solemn oath, and it's then that Jesus breaks his promise. And here's what Caiaphas is asking. Are you some sort of earthly Messiah, some earthly king who's going to break us free? And that's what he's expecting Jesus to be. He's expecting Jesus to claim to be a Davidic king who will come and reign, but as a human. And Jesus doesn't give him the answer that he expects. He doesn't say, "I'm an earthly king." Instead, he looks at them and he says the same thing that he said in the garden. "I am." And then he says, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And at that point, everybody loses it, and they start beating the stuffing out of him and condemning him. And the reason that they do is that everybody gets what he's saying. Isaiah 52:8 declares, when the Lord returns to Zion, they will see it with their own eyes. Psalm 110 says, the Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. But even more than that, Daniel records a vision at night where he sees one like a son of man coming with, and he's given authority and divinity, and he comes with the clouds of heaven, and he's given this authority. And the thing to remember when you look at Daniel 7 is that the clouds of heaven in view aren't water vapors, clouds like we think of earthly clouds. The clouds of heaven are the Shekinah glory of God. And so this figure comes with the Shekinah glory of God that showed up when they were at Mount Sinai, and he's given authority. And Jesus stands there in front of the Sanhedrin, and he says, that's me. I'm going to come with the Shekinah glory clouds. I'm going to come as the judge of the world. I'm going to come and put down evil and injustice. I'm the true judge. Hallelujah. Which is why everybody blows their gasket. They understand what he's saying, and they lose it. And from one perspective, you can see how ridiculous it looks. Here's this man, manacled, abandoned, alone, mocked, telling them that he's the judge of judges, that he's one with God in his glory and majesty, and one with us in our humanness and weakness, that he's the mediator and the Messiah, and he doesn't dance around it. He throws it down in the middle of the room. He says, someday I'll be back with all authority. And they just lose it. And we're told that they beat the stuffing out of him. Luke tells us that they mock him and beat him. And then there's another trial in the morning to make it all legal. And then they cart him off to Caiaphas. And what happens when he's before Caiaphas? When he's now standing before the earthly power, he doesn't back down. He tells Caiaphas that he is the king. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. He says, if my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered. But my kingdom is not of this world. And so Pilate says, you are a king. And Jesus says, you say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born. For this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. And so Jesus says absolutely, clearly, yes, I'm a king. And he doesn't just say, yes, I'm a king. I'm a king above all kings. I'm a king not of this world. I'm a king that was born into this world, that's come into this world. My kingdom is not from this world. Pilate doesn't really know what to do with that. I mean, he kind of looks at it and thinks it's the ravings of a madman on one level, which is why he wants to let him off. And on top of that, his wife has sent message saying, have nothing to do with this man. So he's looking to get out of condemning Jesus. Meanwhile, the religious leaders, after when they sent Jesus to Pilate, are putting pressure on Pilate. They made him come out and talk to him, and they didn't want to go in because they would become defiled or unclean to go into the house of Pilate, and that would mean they couldn't take the Passover. But notice Jesus makes this claim again and again and again. He does not back down from it. He drives it home. He says, I am the king and ruler. And here's the thing, in the ancient world, unlike in this world, unlike in our country, we split up the judiciary and the administrative. In the ancient world, the king was the final arbiter. He was the true judge, the ultimate judge. He was the final word. You know, we talk about, some presidents will say the buck stops with me. The buck stopped with the king. He was ruler and judge, and Jesus is saying, I'm the ruler and judge, and I'm the ultimate ruler and judge. I'm the judge of judges. I'm the judge who will judge. And he said this before. When you go back to John 5, Jesus makes clear that he will judge. He says the hour is coming and is now here when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. He says that as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. and he says that he will judge. The Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, so that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. He says again and again, I'm the judge, and he says it here. He says, I'm the ultimate judge, I'm the ruler, I'm in control. And there's a whole bunch of implications that flow out of this. The first is that we need to recognize what he is saying. He's making the claim to be the ultimate and true revealer of God. But beyond that, he's making a claim that demands commitment. He's taking away our options, saying, I'm the one you have to commit to. I'm the one you have to turn to. So often we live in a way that we try to keep our options open. If you think of like an athlete on defense, we sort of live like that. We try to stay on the balls of our feet, not overcommit in one way or another. And Jesus is saying, you have to commit to me. I'm making a claim that leaves you with no place to say, that's interesting. You have to deal with my claims and deal with what I'm saying. But beyond that, he's saying, I set the terms of reality. I'm the judge, I'm the king, I'm the ruler. I set the terms of reality, and we should not miss this. We're living in a culture that seems to be rebelling against reality. You don't need me to recount all the ways that we can see this in our culture. 1984, 2 + 2 = 5. The party tells you that, then you need to accept it. Sometimes I feel like that's the culture that we're living in. The Cambridge Dictionary is redefining woman, and so is all of our culture. And we live in a culture trying to rebel against God's reality, instituting what some refer to as a new civic religion. And so what do we do as the people of God? We look at the fact that he's the ruler, he's the creator, he's the king, he's the one that defines reality, and we say, no matter what, I will line up with that. We should not miss this. Recently, somebody said, when Christians get discipled by the culture, their emotions calibrate to the culture's ethics. Then only moral actions and statements that align with the world's ideologies feel like the way of Jesus to that Christian. And that writer is absolutely correct. And we need to say, I must line up with Christ come what may. I need to be shaped by his judgment, where he would take me, come what may. Now that's the third implication. Here's the fourth. We should be prepared for the judgments of Jesus to be opposed by the world. They are here, and they will be till the day he returns. And as long as we've sided with him and turned to him and submitted to his rule, submitted to his judgments, we should expect that the culture will push on us in ways that are hard. One writer pointed out that at this moment, long-held beliefs and values drawn from Christian doctrine are now seen as extreme. Assumptions shared by nearly everyone a few decades ago are seen as beyond the pale. And then he goes on, as fewer and fewer people identify with a religious tradition, those who adhere today to institutional forms of religion fall further and further outside of the mainstream. In the generations past, respectable religiosity and cultural Christianity presented their own set of challenges to true faith and practice. In our era, the danger of abandoning our first love manifests itself through the pressure of a society where Christianity is not the norm, and common Christian belief and morals no longer seem plausible. In the midst of common flux, stability is now regarded as suspicious, and so there's all of this pressure that's going to be put on us and is at this point being put on us. And so we need to expect that. We cannot be so foolish as to think that following Jesus is going to be easy. It was not for the first Christians, and it will not be now. Now, with this as a fifth implication, we need to communicate the gospel clearly and without shame. One commentator looked at this and pointed out that when you look at what Jesus does here, he does not back down from his claims. He does not back down from what he has been teaching and saying. And what is the implication of that? Matthew Henry points out the doctrine of Christ, purely and plainly preached, needs not be ashamed to appear in the most numerous assemblies, for it carries its own strength and beauty along with it. We need not be ashamed of it. Now, all of that is, to a degree, the first point. But the rest of them are going to go quickly from here. That is the main thing. The rest of them are going to go quickly from here. When we look at the trial of Jesus, what do we see when we continue on? We see a second truth. Jesus is the judge, but he's the judge that was judged. He's the judge being judged. He's the judge of all the earth, and yet he's being judged. He's God in the hands of angry sinners, being judged. And when we think about that, and we think about the fact that he's struck with a rod in the middle of this trial, where does that take us? It takes us back to the only other time in Scripture that you see God on trial in this way. It takes us back to Exodus 17. What do you see there? The people are in the wilderness, and they're thirsty, and they start grumbling, and they start complaining, and at that point, God, and they assemble, and they're threatening and planning on killing Moses, and God says to Moses, pass before the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. And he tells them to go to a rock, and this is important. The staff is the symbol of justice. The staff, the rod, is the symbol of justice. This is what judges held in trials. This is what Moses held when he stood before Pharaoh and clashed with him and judged Egypt for its evil. And God says, I want you to assemble before the rock, and I want you, Moses, to bring the staff, the rod, which meant there was going to be a trial. And Moses probably had to think, okay, now these people are going to get it. How dare you put God on trial? But then something happens. Moses is told, I will stand on the rock before the people. I will stand there on the rock at Horeb. This is incredibly unprecedented. Up till that point, there's no place where God has ever said to stand before the people. You can't find it. And now he says, I'll stand before the people. And then Moses is told, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out, and the people will drink. He's telling Moses to strike the spot where he's standing. He's saying, I want you to judge me. And what happens? Moses does, and water flows out, and the people are saved. And the question that had to be in Moses' mind is, how can this happen? And it's easy for us to look at the people and say, I can't believe they grumbled against God. I can't believe they put God on trial. But yet, in so many ways, we all do this. In fact, according to C.S. Lewis, the approach that our culture usually takes when it comes to God, whether we think about it this way or not, is to put God in the dock. He says the ancient man approached God normally as the accused person comes to his judge. The modern man comes in a different way, in a way that is reversed. He says God is in the dock. Man is a kindly judge. If God should give some reasonable defense for being the God who permits war, poverty, and disease, he's ready to listen. The trial may even end up in God's acquittal, but the most important thing is man is on the bench and God is in the dock. And he's right. And so often we can look at God and say, God, why is this way? Why is this thing happening? We put ourselves in the role of judge and grumble about the things that God has put in our life. Why isn't my life this comfortable like that person? Why does this person have that, and why don't I have that? And what are we doing in that moment? We're judging him. We stand in judgment of God. And that's the essence of sin. The essence of sin is man substituting himself for God, as Stott says. And what does God say? God says, I will go. And what he is doing in that moment is he is bearing the weight of their sins. And he's pointing forward to what would happen ultimately. Because you know what Paul says when he looks at 1 Corinthians, or when he writes 1 Corinthians? Paul says something shocking, something that had to be the answer to the question that was in Moses' mind, and it's in our mind when we look at it. How can God be judged? How can God bear the weight of judgment? Moses says something. Paul says something. He says the rock was Christ. Ultimately, all of that was pointing forward to the moment when Christ would bear our judgment. And what's going on there in that trial? Jesus is substituting himself for us. We deserve to be judged. We deserve to be in the dock. We're the ones that rebelled. And Jesus is substituting himself for us. Stott says, sin is substituting yourself for God. Salvation is God substituting himself for us. Sin is taking for yourself the prerogatives that only God deserves. Salvation is taking on himself the penalty we all deserve. And here's the thing. Jesus says again and again, I'm going to judge. And the question that comes up is, how do we face Judgment Day? The reality is, we need a judge. We need somebody to come and put the world right. We look around at the brokenness of the world, and it has to be dealt with. We know that intuitively. It takes the quiet of a comfortable suburb, as Miroslav Volf points out, to want a God with that doesn't judge. But if you live in a place with real brokenness, you know that there has to be justice. If you've seen your loved ones raped and killed, if you've seen tyrants abuse people, you know that there has to be judgment, or you have to deal with it yourself. And so we need a Judgment Day. But on the other hand, how do we face Judgment Day? And that's a tension throughout Scripture. How do we face Judgment Day? And here's the answer. We have a judge who's judged, a judge who stood in our place and bore the judgment we deserve. And now what does that mean? Someday we've held high, we can face eternity with joy because of what Christ has done. Someday we can say to his face, amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, shouldst die for me? And know that he has made it so that we can stand on Judgment Day. Now, I'm just going to be very brief with the third point. Jesus is making clear all through here that he will judge ultimately. He stands before Annas and doesn't flinch. He makes it explicit in Mark and in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He makes it clear here. He's going to judge ultimately. There will be a day when he judges. And the one clear implication of that is somebody needs to have borne your judgment. Either somebody will need to bear your judgment. Either you will bear your judgment or he will bear your judgment. Which means that as you look at what he does here, as you look at what he does on the cross, you need to see that he is our only refuge from the coming day of judgment. All of that launches us into the final thing I want to say. Jesus is the judge whose judgment changes you. There's a lot of different ways that his judgment changes us. There's a lot of different ways that the gospel changes us. But let me give you a few when we think about the fact that Christ stood in our place and bore our condemnation. First of all, it's going to make us gracious towards others. The fact that he's the judge and that he stood in our place and bore our judgment gives us an ability to, first of all, stand and refuse to bend and say, here is truth, and I'm not going to run away from it. But do so without pride or arrogance. Do so with a sense of a graciousness, knowing it allows you to say, look, he sacrificed himself for me. He died for me. I'm somebody who's a rebel and a sinner and needs grace. And therefore, even though I disagree with you strongly, I can still show grace in the middle of this. We should not miss this. We're in a moment in the church, not so much our church, but the larger church, where there's a conversation going on about how do we walk through this. And some would essentially pick up the way of the world and swing back. And some that have been referred to as the winsome approach would essentially just fold. And we cannot take either approach. On the one hand, we must continue to hold fast to the truth, but do so in a way that is gracious and loving at the same time. We must hold those things together. And so it allows us to be gracious towards others, but then with that, it allows us to forgive others. If we know that we have sinned against a holy God and have been forgiven, if we see our God standing before angry sinners, that changes how we deal with forgiveness. The only way you can forgive ultimately is if you see that you've been forgiven. There's a debt that's created. Somebody has to pay the bill. How do we forgive? We look at the fact that he stepped out of the bench and he paid the bill. With this, I would say this allows us to rest when injustice happens to us. You know, like I said, if you see true evil and injustice, you know it has to be dealt with. And if you don't believe that there's a holy God who will judge, you're going to be driven to pick up the sword. And yet, because he has taken the punishment, and because he will deal with all evil and injustice someday, we can rest knowing that we don't have to pick up the sword. We can forgive as God and God has forgiven us. We can act with grace, and we can even turn the other cheek. And we can rest knowing that he will judge all evil someday. It will either be judged at the cross, or it will be judged by the one who judged and borne by the one who committed the evil. But someday every injustice will be judged. We can rest in that. Beyond this, I would say, seeing this, seeing what he's done, allows you to know that you are not alone in your suffering. You know, Jesus is identifying with us and suffering. You know, he suffers as one unjustly tried. He doesn't just suffer for us, he suffers with us. He suffers as one unjustly tried. And everybody at some point deals with injustice in their life or sees injustice. God does not leave us alone in that. He does not leave us alone in our suffering. Beyond this, and I'll to go back to what I was saying earlier, this truth calls for a commitment. This changes us by putting us in a place where we have to make a choice. The fact of the matter is, seeing Christ making these claims pushes us to make a decision. It pushes us to respond, to say, what will I do with Jesus? You know, that's the question that Pilate is going to wrestle with as he goes through. What will I do with Jesus? And this demands that we wrestle with this and say, what will I do with Jesus? Knowing that he is the judge who was judged. How do you respond to that? How do you respond to what he has done for you? Do you just shake it off? Do you shake him off? Do you respond the way that the religious leaders did, with anger and enmity? You know, they struck him, they spit in his face, they beat him. Before he's done, he's gone through every kind of indignity. What do you do with Jesus? Do you say, I don't care what you did? Do you really want to do that? There's a story about an archbishop in Paris who was preaching to a great congregation. He told them about 3 worldly, godless young men who wandered into a cathedral, and 2 of them bet the third one that he could not make a phony confession to the priest. And the priest, being smart enough to catch on, listened to the confession, and when the young man had finished, he said, to every confession there's a penance. Do you see that crucifix over there? Go to it, kneel down, and repeat 3 times. As you look in the face of the crucified, you did this all for me, and I could not care less. And the young man emerged from the confession box to collect his bet, and his friends, when they heard what the priest had said, oh no, you have to complete this and win, you have to do the penance, and then we'll pay you. And so he walked over towards the crucifix, and he kneeled down, and he looked at the statue, and he said, you did all this for me, and he didn't get any further. And as the priest told it, tears flooded the young man's eyes, and his heart began to be broken for his sin, and his old life ended and his new life began. And do you know how that priest ended the story? He said, I was that young man. Look, I don't know where you're at. Some of you are in your living room, and I may never know who you are. I don't know where you're at, but I do know this. If you have not trusted Christ, his coming, his bearing the judgment, pushes you to respond. Look at him. Look at him on trial, and let the reality of that melt your heart and lead you to say, you did all this for me, and I trust you. I worship you. I take myself off the bench and throw myself upon your great mercy. Look at what he did and trust him. That's my plea to you. Let's pray.